You can steal a man's land with forged paperwork, but you can never steal the truth buried underneath it. The first thing I noticed wasn't the rows of brand new houses stretching across what used to be my family's wheat fields. It was the smell. Fresh-cut sod mixed with wet concrete and new asphalt drifted through the open window of my pickup long before I reached the front gate. 20 years ago, that same breeze carried nothing but wild grass, cedar trees, and the rich scent of freshly turned soil after my grandfather finished another day on his tractor. I eased my truck onto the shoulder, gravel crunching beneath the tires exactly the way I remembered, except the familiar sound was now drowned out by nail guns, backup alarms, and the constant hum of landscapers putting the finishing touches on what looked like a picture-perfect suburban neighborhood. A polished stone monument stood where our old wooden entrance sign once welcomed visitors. Willow Ridge Estates. Luxury country living. I stared at those words for several long seconds, convinced I had somehow taken the wrong county road. My family owned 5,200 acres here. Every fence line, every pond, every hill, every oak tree had been passed down through 4 generations of hard work. My grandfather used to joke that if you stood on the highest ridge at sunrise, you could almost see tomorrow rolling across our fields. Now all I could see were identical rooftops shimmering beneath the Texas sun. A security guard stepped out of a small brick gatehouse wearing a pressed uniform that still smelled like fresh fabric from the packaging. He raised one hand politely before I even rolled down my window. "Morning, sir. Residents only." I smiled without answering. He glanced at the faded ranch logo on my truck door and then toward the clipboard tucked beneath his arm. "If you're here for construction work, deliveries go around back." I looked beyond him instead. Children were riding bicycles down streets that didn't exist the last time I drove through here. Families unloaded patio furniture. Moving trucks backed into driveways. A young couple planted flowers where my grandmother once grew tomatoes every summer. They looked happy, completely unaware. They weren't my enemies. They were living inside someone else's lie. "Sir," the guard repeated, "I'm going to need you to turn around." I finally looked back at him. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded. "Who owned this land before all these houses were built?" He shrugged. "Developer bought it from the HOA last year. At least that's what everyone says." I felt my heartbeat slow instead of speed up. Panic would have been easy. Anger would have been understandable. But something about that answer settled my mind with a calm that surprised even me. The HOA. Not the developer. Not a bank. Not the county. The HOA sold it. That was impossible. An HOA couldn't legally sell property it never owned, unless someone had convinced everyone they did. I reached into the worn leather folder resting on the passenger seat, running my fingers across papers older than the neighborhood itself. My grandfather always said documents outlive memories. Standing there with the smell of fresh paint filling the air and the sound of children laughing across land my family had worked for nearly a century, I realized something the people celebrating their new homes didn't know yet. They hadn't bought my farm. They had unknowingly built their future on the biggest real estate fraud our county had ever seen. I was not born into wealth. I was born into responsibility. My earliest memories were not vacations or amusement parks, but sunrise walks beside my grandfather, Henry Cole, whose weathered hands could tell whether rain would arrive simply by rubbing a handful of dirt between his fingers. He never called the farm an investment. He called it a promise. Every fence post, every cattle trail, every irrigation ditch had been built with the understanding that someone in our family would always come back to take care of it. My father carried that promise after him, and when he passed away unexpectedly 12 years ago, it became mine. The 5,200 acres stretched farther than most people could imagine. There were rolling hay fields, grazing pastures, hardwood groves, 2 natural ponds, and a spring-fed creek that never ran dry, even during the hottest Texas summers. We leased portions of the land to neighboring ranchers, protected wildlife habitats along the creek, and maintained agricultural production that had supported local families for decades. I left for college to study land surveying because my grandfather believed understanding maps was just as important as understanding tractors. Later, I spent years working as a professional land survey engineer, helping counties resolve boundary disputes, pipeline easements, and floodplain projects across the state. Every time I unfolded an old deed or examined a survey marker hammered into the ground generations earlier, I thought about home. After my father passed away, I placed the ranch into a professionally managed family trust. Property taxes were automatically paid. Insurance remained current. Local ranchers continued leasing sections for grazing cattle. Everything was organized exactly the way my attorney recommended, while my career kept me traveling from one infrastructure project to another. I visited whenever I could, sometimes for a weekend, sometimes for only a single afternoon before another assignment called me away. I never imagined that temporary absence could be mistaken for abandonment. My grandfather always laughed at that idea. He used to stand beside the old red barn, coffee steaming from his tin mug, and point across the hills. Land remembers who takes care of it, he would say. People forget. Paperwork gets misplaced. Politicians come and go. But land remembers. Back then I thought he was speaking like an old rancher chasing poetry. Standing outside that gated subdivision, I finally understood exactly what he meant. The oak tree where I carved my initials at 10 years old was still standing, squeezed awkwardly between two oversized brick homes. The old windmill had been repainted bright white as a decorative landmark beside a neighborhood park. Even the creek that watered our cattle now curved behind expensive backyards where wooden decks overlooked water that had once reflected nothing except open sky. The developers had changed almost everything, but they could not erase the bones of the ranch beneath their streets. Every curve in the road followed an old tractor path. Every retention pond matched one of our original stock tanks. Every property line whispered pieces of a map I could still draw from memory with my eyes closed. As I watched a moving truck unload boxes into a freshly built house, I reached into my truck again and unfolded the original county survey my grandfather framed decades earlier. The paper smelled faintly of old leather and dust despite being carefully preserved inside protective sleeves. My eyes traced every handwritten measurement until they stopped on one familiar signature near the bottom of the page. Suddenly I realized there was one document I had not thought about in years, one document almost nobody outside my family even knew existed. And if my memory was correct, every single house surrounding me had been built on rights that could never have been transferred in the first place. I folded the survey back into its protective sleeve and drove straight to the county records office before anyone could convince me I was remembering things wrong. The courthouse had not changed much since my grandfather used to bring me there as a kid. The same limestone walls reflected the afternoon heat. The same ceiling fans pushed cool air that carried the faint smell of old paper, copier toner, and polished wood. Behind the public records counter sat an older clerk with silver hair tucked neatly beneath her reading glasses. Her name tag read Linda, and when I handed her the legal description of our ranch, she smiled politely before typing into her computer. That smile disappeared almost immediately. Her eyebrows narrowed. She clicked through several screens, then quietly excused herself to speak with someone in the back office. 5 long minutes later, she returned carrying a thick stack of printed filings that had clearly been accessed many times over the previous 2 years. "These are all public records," she said carefully. "You are welcome to review them." The first document nearly made me laugh from disbelief. According to the filing, my family's ranch had supposedly been declared abandoned after years of owner neglect. Another filing claimed the property had been transferred into a community redevelopment initiative before eventually being conveyed to the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association. From there, the association sold parcels to a residential development company that subdivided the acreage into hundreds of individual lots. Every page looked professionally prepared. Every signature appeared properly notarized. Every stamp carried official county markings. To someone unfamiliar with the ranch, the paperwork would seem completely legitimate. But I knew every acre too well. Several survey references described fence lines that had never existed. Easements appeared across creeks that flowed in entirely different directions. Boundary markers had somehow moved hundreds of feet without a single licensed survey revision ever being recorded. Whoever assembled the package understood legal language well enough to fool almost anyone except someone who had spent 2 decades surveying property for a living. As I continued reading, one name appeared over and over again. Patricia Holloway, president of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association. Her signature authorized neighborhood expansion requests, infrastructure approvals, access agreements, and finally the master purchase contract transferring the entire development. She had signed so many documents that her name almost became part of the decorative letterhead. The more pages I turned, the clearer the pattern became. This had never been one careless mistake. It had been a carefully choreographed process involving title paperwork, zoning requests, planning meetings, engineering reports, and dozens of routine approvals that looked harmless when viewed individually. Together, they created an illusion that my family's ranch had quietly changed hands while I was busy working across the state. I requested copies of every filing and carried the heavy box out to my truck as evening sunlight stretched across the courthouse parking lot. Sitting behind the steering wheel, I spread the documents across the passenger seat beside my grandfather's original survey. The contrast was almost surreal. One stack represented generations of legitimate ownership built through honest work. The other represented an elaborate paper trail designed to replace truth with convenience. Most people would have hired an attorney that very afternoon and filed a lawsuit before sunset. For a few minutes, I considered doing exactly that. Then another realization settled into place. If I challenged everything immediately, construction would stop, buyers would panic, and whoever orchestrated this scheme would have months to hide evidence behind endless legal delays. I closed every folder, started the engine, and quietly drove away. Sometimes the fastest way to uncover the full truth is to let people believe their perfect plan has already succeeded. The next 2 weeks became the strangest investigation of my life because I spent most of it pretending I had accepted defeat. Every morning I parked outside the subdivision with a cup of black coffee and watched moving trucks come and go. The smell of fresh mulch drifted across the sidewalks, while contractors planted young maple trees beside sidewalks that crossed what used to be our cattle trails. Delivery vans unloaded refrigerators. School buses stopped at corners named after flowers that had never grown there. Families smiled as they carried boxes through front doors, believing they had finally found the neighborhood where they would build their future. None of them realized they had unknowingly stepped into the middle of a legal disaster. Instead of confronting anyone, I started collecting information the same way I had documented survey boundaries for 20 years. Every lot number, every closing date, every title company involved, every mortgage lender, every permit issued by the county. I filled notebook after notebook with names, addresses, recording numbers, and transaction histories. Patterns began appearing almost immediately. Nearly every sale had closed through the same title office. The engineering certifications came from the same consulting firm. Infrastructure inspections had been signed within unusually short time frames. Even utility easements followed identical filing schedules, as though someone had carefully choreographed the entire development from beginning to end. One afternoon, I visited the county planning department under the simple pretense of researching historical zoning maps. A young planner proudly showed me digital overlays of the subdivision. While he explained drainage improvements and roadway alignments, I quietly noticed something much more interesting. The original agricultural designation had not disappeared. It had simply been hidden beneath later amendments that referenced earlier filings without replacing them. That tiny detail would mean nothing to most people, but to someone trained in land records, it was like spotting a loose thread in an expensive suit. Pull carefully enough, and the entire thing could come apart. Later that evening, I drove to the small diner where ranchers still gathered after sunset. The smell of grilled onions and fresh coffee had not changed since my grandfather used to bring me there on Fridays. A retired surveyor named Bill recognized me almost immediately. We spent hours talking about old boundary markers, forgotten easements, and county record changes over slices of homemade pie. Before leaving, Bill leaned across the table and lowered his voice. "Nathan, everybody assumed you sold because the paperwork looked official. Nobody questioned it. But I always wondered why nobody could ever produce the original agricultural release." Those words stayed with me all the way back to my motel room. Original agricultural release. I spread every copied document across the bed until midnight, comparing recording numbers, signatures, filing dates, and legal descriptions one page at a time. The deeper I looked, the stranger everything became. Hundreds of documents referred to an approval that should have existed, yet not one of them actually contained it. They all assumed someone else had already verified it. Every office relied on another office. Every signature trusted a previous signature. The entire transaction chain rested on a document nobody had ever bothered to confirm. I leaned back in my chair and listened to the steady hum of the motel air conditioner while rain tapped softly against the window. For the first time since discovering the subdivision, I smiled. Patricia Holloway had built what looked like a perfect legal fortress, but somewhere beneath thousands of pages of polished paperwork was a missing foundation stone. She believed she had buried my family's ownership beneath enough official documents that nobody would ever question them again. She never imagined someone would patiently read every single page until the silence between the lines became louder than the words themselves. The breakthrough arrived where I least expected to find it. Not inside a courtroom. Not inside the county archives. It was sitting inside an old fireproof filing cabinet in the back office of my family's abandoned equipment barn, exactly where my grandfather used to keep every important document wrapped inside heavy brown envelopes labeled in his unmistakable handwriting. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight as I pulled open drawer after drawer, breathing in the familiar scent of machine oil, cedar wood, and aging paper that somehow still felt like home. Most of the folders contained equipment warranties, livestock records, and faded photographs from county fairs decades ago. Then I found a sealed envelope with my father's name written across the front in thick black ink, followed by 5 simple words. Never record unless absolutely necessary. My pulse slowed as I carefully unfolded the papers inside. The first page was not a deed. It was something far more unusual. In 1978, my grandfather had entered into a permanent agricultural preservation covenant with the state in exchange for water conservation grants and soil restoration funding after a severe drought. The agreement restricted future transfers of the property unless the covenant was formally released by the original family trust or its lawful successor. That release required 3 separate conditions: written approval from the trust, certification from the State Agricultural Commission, and a recorded release signed by the registered beneficiary. I had already seen hundreds of transfer documents over the past 2 weeks, yet I had never once seen that release because it did not exist. My grandfather never canceled the covenant. My father never canceled it. And after my father passed away, I became the sole lawful trustee through the family trust documents. I read every page twice, then a third time, checking dates, signatures, recording references, and statutory citations against the copies I had gathered from the courthouse. Everything matched perfectly except for one critical detail. Every subdivision approval assumed the covenant had already been terminated. Nobody had ever verified it. Somewhere along the process, everyone simply accepted someone else's assumption and kept moving. I immediately called the State Agricultural Records Office. After transferring me through several departments, a woman with a calm voice searched the historical database. I could hear keyboards clicking before she paused. "Mr. Cole, according to our records, your family's preservation covenant remains active and has never been released." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. She continued, almost apologetically. "Any transfer that required cancellation of that covenant would normally require documentation signed by the current trustee." "And who does your system list as the current trustee?" I asked. More typing echoed through the phone. "Nathan Cole." I thanked her, ended the call, and sat alone inside the old barn listening to wind rattle the metal roof. My grandfather had protected this land decades before anyone imagined luxury subdivisions would replace ranches across the county. He had built a legal safeguard that quietly survived changing administrations, changing zoning laws, changing developers, and even changing generations. Patricia Holloway had spent years constructing an impressive tower of contracts, approvals, mortgages, and sales, but every single one rested on a missing legal step that only one living person had the authority to complete. And that person had never signed a single piece of paper. At that moment, I finally understood why my grandfather insisted that documents outlive memories. He had never expected me to fight this battle with anger. He had expected me to finish it with patience. Once I confirmed the covenant was still active, every instinct told me to march straight into the courthouse and demand everything be frozen immediately. Instead, I did the exact opposite. I stayed quiet. That decision confused even my own attorney when I finally hired one. Rebecca Lawson specialized in complex land disputes, and after reviewing my documents for nearly 3 hours, she leaned back in her chair and asked the obvious question. "Why have you waited this long?" I looked through the window toward the courthouse square where people carried on with their ordinary Tuesday afternoon. "Because they are still making the same mistake every single day." She studied me for a moment before slowly nodding. She understood. Filing too early would only encourage everyone involved to stop the transactions, rewrite paperwork, and spend years arguing procedural issues. Every additional closing, however, created another layer of documented reliance built upon the same missing legal requirement. The evidence was growing stronger without me lifting a finger. Over the following month, I quietly became the most informed observer in the county. Every morning began with fresh county recording updates downloaded from public records. Every afternoon, I visited title filings, planning notices, and tax assessments. Every evening, I organized everything into carefully labeled binders until my motel room looked more like a professional archive than temporary lodging. The steady hum of my laptop mixed with the sound of passing freight trains while stacks of documents slowly climbed higher across the small wooden desk. Closing number 182. Closing number 183. New mortgage recorded. Warranty deed transferred. Utility easement accepted. Property tax account established. Every signature added another piece to the same puzzle. Meanwhile, Willow Ridge Estates celebrated its success. Newspaper articles praised the development for bringing economic growth to the county. Real estate advertisements described peaceful country living with modern conveniences. Patricia Holloway smiled in ribbon-cutting photographs beside county officials as if she had personally transformed forgotten farmland into the community of the future. I attended one of those public celebrations wearing an ordinary baseball cap and jeans. Nobody recognized me. The smell of grilled hamburgers drifted through the neighborhood park while children laughed near a newly installed playground built almost exactly where our old equipment shed had once stood. Patricia stood near the clubhouse, greeting homeowners with polished confidence, thanking everyone for believing in her vision. Listening from a distance, I realized something important. She genuinely believed she had already won. Confidence has a way of making people careless. She openly discussed future expansion phases, additional land acquisitions, and long-term investment opportunities without the slightest concern that someone might question the foundation beneath everything she had built. I left before the ceremony ended and drove to the highest remaining hill overlooking the subdivision. Sunset painted hundreds of rooftops in shades of gold, while porch lights flickered on one by one across land my grandfather had once crossed in an aging pickup truck. I did not feel anger anymore. I felt responsibility. Those families deserved certainty. The banks deserved the truth. Even the construction workers deserved to know the projects they helped build rested upon defective ownership. But exposing everything required patience for just a little longer. Rebecca called me the following morning with news that made my careful strategy even more valuable. The State Agricultural Commission had officially certified my trustee status and confirmed in writing that no lawful release had ever been requested or approved. She paused before speaking her next sentence. Nathan, every transaction they completed after the first unauthorized transfer may now depend entirely on what you decide to do next. I quietly closed the binder in front of me. The waiting was over. Now it was time to let the documents speak for themselves. The hearing was scheduled for a quiet Thursday morning, and by 8:30 the courthouse hallway smelled like fresh coffee, floor polish, and nervous anticipation. Rebecca carried 2 organized binders while I carried the old leather folder my grandfather had protected for decades. Across the hall, Patricia Holloway stood surrounded by attorneys, consultants, and representatives from the development company. She laughed confidently, greeting people by first name as though this would be another routine procedural meeting. When she noticed me, her smile barely changed. "Mr. Cole," she said pleasantly, "I heard you finally hired counsel. I hope we can resolve this misunderstanding quickly." I simply nodded. There was nothing left to argue in the hallway. Inside the hearing room, every document was placed on long wooden tables beneath bright overhead lights. The quiet rustle of paper echoed through the room as attorneys organized exhibits and clerks confirmed filing numbers. Rebecca began with something surprisingly simple. She did not accuse anyone of fraud. She did not raise her voice. She merely introduced the original Agricultural Preservation Covenant, the certified trust records, and the official confirmation from the State Agricultural Commission that the covenant had never been released. One by one, each document entered the record. The judge read silently for several minutes before looking toward Patricia's legal team. "Please provide the recorded release referenced by your transfer documents." A young attorney confidently stood and searched through several binders. Another joined him. Pages turned faster. Sticky notes appeared. Quiet conversations became increasingly tense. Finally, he admitted, "Your Honor, we are still locating that exhibit." Rebecca calmly replied, "Respectfully, there is no exhibit to locate because no release was ever executed." The room became so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system above us. The judge requested a short recess while county recording officials verified the filing history. 45 minutes later, everyone returned with certified records projected onto a large courtroom screen. Every transfer, every subdivision approval, every recorded deed referenced an agricultural restriction that everyone assumed had already been removed. Yet the official database showed exactly the opposite. The restriction remained active from the day my grandfather signed it until that very morning. No cancellation, no lawful authorization, no trustee approval, nothing. The judge slowly removed his glasses and looked across the courtroom. If the covenant remained in force, then the authority required for these transfers never legally existed. Nobody interrupted because nobody could. Patricia's confident posture faded for the first time since I had returned home. Her attorneys requested additional time. The developers requested clarification. Representatives from 2 title companies quietly exchanged worried expressions while bank counsel began reviewing mortgage files with remarkable urgency. The effect spread through the room like falling dominoes. Nobody shouted. Nobody celebrated. The law simply continued moving exactly as it was written decades earlier. Before the hearing concluded, the court ordered additional review of every affected transaction and directed that no further transfers proceed until ownership questions were fully resolved. As people gathered their files, Patricia finally looked directly at me. There was no confidence left in her expression, only disbelief. I realized she had spent years trusting signatures, approvals, and assumptions while ignoring the one document that actually controlled everything. My grandfather had once told me that the strongest fence is the one nobody notices until they try to cross it. Sitting there with that old leather folder resting quietly on the table beside me, I finally understood what he meant. The weeks that followed changed the entire county without a single dramatic confrontation because the paperwork accomplished what anger never could. Every title company involved received certified notice that the chain of ownership remained under judicial review. Mortgage lenders paused new funding. County officials temporarily suspended additional permits while independent examiners reviewed decades of filings. The steady rhythm of construction that had filled the air for months slowly faded until the only sounds left were lawn sprinklers, distant birds, and the occasional hammer from homeowners finishing projects inside houses they had purchased in complete good faith. Rebecca and I spent countless hours meeting with state officials, banking representatives, and property attorneys. Our goal was never to punish the families who had unknowingly bought homes. They had relied on professionals, signed documents presented to them, and trusted a system that was supposed to protect them. The real responsibility rested with the parties that claimed authority they never legally possessed. That distinction became the foundation of every discussion that followed. One afternoon, we gathered inside a conference room overlooking the courthouse square. Long tables were covered with maps, title reports, trust records, and lender agreements. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the quiet rustle of legal paper as representatives worked through possible resolutions. Then the unavoidable conclusion emerged. Because the original transfers lacked lawful authority under the active covenant, every later conveyance depended upon rights that had never legally existed. The room fell silent. Nobody argued with the documents anymore. They simply searched for the least harmful way forward. Several weeks later, the court entered a series of orders recognizing the family trust as the lawful owner while authorizing a structured process to resolve the affected properties. Instead of forcing innocent residents into endless uncertainty, the court supervised an orderly program that allowed ownership interests to be transferred through lawful transactions under the trust. Financial institutions, insurers, and settlement professionals coordinated revised closings that protected homeowners while correcting the defective chain of title. For the first time since I drove back onto the ranch, I stood at the subdivision entrance without feeling the weight of unanswered questions. The stone monument still welcomed visitors, but now survey crews quietly marked boundaries again, this time using records that actually matched the land beneath their feet. Families continued watering gardens, children continued riding bicycles, and life moved forward because the solution focused on restoring certainty instead of creating chaos. Watching those revised transactions unfold felt surreal. The same homes that had once been marketed through an unlawful chain were now being conveyed through valid authority recognized by the court. Every closing represented another piece of order replacing confusion. Every properly recorded deed closed another chapter of uncertainty. Patricia Holloway attended several proceedings during that period, but she rarely spoke. The confidence that once surrounded her had been replaced by long conversations with attorneys and careful review of documents she should have examined years earlier. Standing beside the old oak tree one evening, I watched sunlight settle across rooftops that now rested upon lawful records instead of assumptions. The breeze carried the familiar scent of cut grass, and somewhere beyond the neighborhood, I could still hear wind moving across the remaining open fields. My grandfather had been right all along. Land remembers. It remembers every honest survey, every lawful signature, every promise kept across generations. People may build neighborhoods, write contracts, and hold ceremonies, but sooner or later the truth beneath the ground always finds its way back into the record. By the time the final orders were entered, nearly a year had passed since I first stopped outside that stone entrance and realized strangers were living on land my family had cared for generations. The county records had been corrected. Every lawful transfer completed under the court's supervision reflected the truth instead of assumptions. Families who had purchased homes in good faith finally received clear ownership through properly authorized transactions, and the uncertainty that had followed them for months slowly disappeared. That mattered to me more than any personal victory because they had never been the people I was fighting. They wanted a safe place to raise children, plant gardens, and build memories, just like my grandfather once wanted when he first bought the ranch. The difference was that he believed every dream should begin with honesty. Patricia Holloway eventually resigned from the Homeowners Association board before the organization elected an entirely new leadership team. Several professional investigations examined how so many approvals had moved through the system without anyone confirming the underlying ownership requirements. Policies changed. Verification procedures became stricter. Title professionals began referencing the case during continuing education seminars as an example of why assumptions should never replace original records. Rebecca joked that my grandfather probably accomplished more for property law after his passing than most attorneys do during an entire career. I smiled because she was probably right. On my first morning back at the ranch after everything settled, I walked alone toward the highest ridge before sunrise. The cool air carried the familiar scent of cedar, damp soil, and wild grass that had survived every survey, every filing, every courtroom discussion, and every headline. The old oak tree still stood exactly where it always had, its branches stretching across the horizon as if quietly watching another generation come home. I reached into my truck and removed the weathered leather folder one last time. Instead of carrying it back inside, I placed it on the porch of the restored ranch house beside a framed photograph of my grandfather smiling beneath that same tree decades earlier. His promise had never been about protecting dirt. It had always been about protecting integrity. The land had simply become the place where that lesson lived. Looking across the remaining open fields, I could see rooftops in the distance reflecting the early morning sun. They no longer felt like symbols of something stolen. They reminded me that mistakes, even enormous ones, can be corrected when people choose truth over convenience. Every lawful deed now matched the ground beneath it. Every survey marker pointed where it always should have. Every signature finally meant what it claimed to mean. I started the old tractor that had belonged to my father, and the familiar engine settled into its steady rhythm. The sound echoed across fields that had waited patiently for someone to come back and finish what previous generations had started. As the first rays of sunlight rolled across the ranch, I finally understood why my grandfather never worried about time. He trusted that truth could afford to be patient because it never needed to outrun a lie. It only needed to outlast it. And standing there with my hands resting on the same worn steering wheel he once held, I realized the greatest victory was never taking anything away from someone else. It was making sure that, in the end, every acre, every document, and every promise found its rightful place.